Hi, this is Paul. Video. Tom Holland, Stephen Meyer, Douglas Murray, all in one Hoover Institute video. I'm going to start it where Tom Holland, it's interesting listening to Tom work this line because he's been, when did Dominion come out? 3 years ago, something like that. He's been talking about these themes on many different podcasts and many different venues all over the place. And part of what's fun to listen to someone do this is they continue to sort of refine and sharpen. In every context that they give this little talk, it's always a little bit different depending on who they're with. And so he starts kind of a nice take on the secular here and on his thesis of dominion, basically about this process in Christianity of that there's sort of the more you drill down, the more it's sort of like a disenchanting process within Christianity. Now I've been listening to, I'm getting ready for the Vervaeke Jordan B. Cooper conversation that is happening tomorrow. And a lot of what I think, at least on John Vervaeke's side, John is getting at is he wants to, his religion that's not a religion is an attempt to re-enchant the world in a scientifically credible way. That's a project that a lot have wrestled with because a big part of the meaning crisis is the recognition that we can't live. A disenchanted world breeds nihilism. But there are obviously some deep contradictions in there with respect to once the world is within our grasp. It was the intro. Oh gosh, I can pull it up. It's not from The Master and His Emissary. It's from the Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning. Why Are We So Unhappy? By Ian McGilchrist. Just the little quip from Butterfield. How is it that the most able man becomes to manipulate the world to his advantage, the less he can perceive any meaning in it? This is a paradox that has often been noted and sometimes been attributed to fundamental perversity, a sort of pure cussedness in human nature. The world has changed since the philosopher Owen Barfield wrote those words 35 years ago, but the paradox, as he calls it, has gotten no near being resolved, while the evidence has continued to accumulate that his hunch was right. Our increasing ability to manipulate the world does indeed appear somehow connected with its loss of meaning for us. Why? And does that even matter? So let's drop into this.
I've been corrected.
You got corrected.
Fiesole. Here's what I discovered walking around Florence. The place down the hill, the place is mob. But the churches are beautiful, and they're cool, and they're empty. Lovely place to go for a walk. What do you make of that?
Well, I see the repudiation or the decline of institutional Christianity. The paradox is, my paradox, for what it's worth, is
the Holland paradox.
That in itself is an expression of the distinctive character of, let's call it Western Christianity, Latin Christianity. At the molten core of Christianity is the idea that you can be born again, that you can be washed in the baptismal waters and emerge a new being. And what happens very distinctively in the Latin West in the 11th century through the 12th century is that this paradigm is applied to the whole fabric of society. It becomes the ambition of radicals who seize control of the bishopric of Rome, the greatest see in the Latin world, that they will cleanse the whole of Christendom, that they will purge the radiant white robes of the church from the grubby, pouring hands of kings and emperors who also claim a stake in the dimension of the supernatural. And over the course of the Middle Ages, we see twin dimensions emerge. One of these dimensions is what, since the time of Augustine, has been described as the cyculum, which literally means the flux of time, people born on the flux of time heading towards oblivion. That is the fate of fallen mankind. How can mankind be redeemed from that? Well, it can be redeemed by the religio, the bond that can join us to the eternity of heaven. And that is what the church provides. So for the reformers, there are these twin dimensions of the cyculum and religio. And over the course of the Middle Ages and then into the Reformation and into the modern period, this emerges to become idea of the secular and then of there being something called religion. But
and so you have the connection between, I mean, for Vervaeke, we'll talk about the two worlds mythology.
What happens in the Middle Ages is that the kind of the lava of that initial rebellion, that initial process of reformatio, of reformation, calcifies, and the rebels of one age become the elites of another. And this generates the revulsion, Luther's revulsion, Calvin's revulsion, that generates the Reformation. And in the Reformation, you see what early Christians...
And I think this issue will be a big piece of what we're going to talk about with Jordan Cooper and John Vervaeke.
Had done towards the Roman world, the tearing down of idolatry, the banishing of superstition. Only now it is the Roman Church that is seen as something to be torn down. That is a kind of abiding Christian impulse. Moving into the Enlightenment, into the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, you see exactly these same instincts, only now it's not just the Roman Church that is the target of this repudiation. It's the whole fabric of Christianity. But the instinct, the paradox, say, of the French Revolution is that when the revolutionaries are tearing down the privileges and the fabric of the churches,
renaming Notre Dame, what was it, a Temple of Justice?
Temple of Reason.
Temple
yes.
of Reason, right.
Yeah. They're doing it for deeply, deeply Christian reasons. And that's why, I said at the beginning of this, that there is, I think, a kind of inherent trend within Christianity that moves towards atheism, because, even before Christianity, the impulse of the Hebrew prophets is to condemn the gods of the Egyptians or the Babylonians as so much stock or stone, and tell people that there is no divine manifest in springs or on the top of hills. The reformers are doing that in the Reformation. Materialist scientists now are doing that. The process of banishing the super, of desacralizing the world, is an incredibly Christian one.
Surely we have...
Now, of course, at the same time, the Hebrew prophets are talking about the living God, and Luther and Calvin will in some ways fight the Church of Rome over which church is the one where the living God can be found.
I think, I say surely as if I'm sure of this. I'm not. René Girard would draw the distinction between Christianity proper and hyper-Christianity, which seizes upon, and this was Girard's, the point you just made, as far as I understand it, was extremely close to, if not exactly the same point that René Girard was making, which is that hyper-Christianity is actually quite dangerous. There's a notion of egalitarianism in Christianity. The communists take that value and blow it up and lose the sense of proportion, lose the larger context of values.
It becomes a secularized form of religion
Doug,
and you can listen to Tom's treatment of communism on some early episodes of The Rest is History.
Douglas writes in The War of the West, as Christianity has withdrawn, so one new religion in particular has found its way into the cultural mainstream. It is the new religion of anti-racism. With other grand narratives collapsed, the religion of anti-racism fills people with purpose and a sense of meaning.
And I think, while that's true, what we've seen is that many different religions rush in and fill people with a sense of meaning. And so then what happens is that spirituality and religion itself is defined as that which rushes in and fills us with a sense of meaning, making then, in many ways, the Peterson-Vervaeke conversation dropped. I haven't had a chance to listen to the whole thing. but it gives people a sense of whatever feels meaningful is my religion. And so you have all sorts of crazy religions. So I'm now in season 3 of Rami, and at one point he has to get a jewel. Spoiler alert: he really starts to succeed in the jewelry business, and even gets a little distance from his uncle. He has to get a jewel for someone who wants to implant a jewel in his forehead, and that person, his identity is an elf. I'm so tempted to go and hit another video. That Rod sends me so much good stuff, but the issue here with wokeness and anti-racism isn't just the content of the thing. It's the observation I made a while ago with James Lindsay's, watching a conversation he had with Benjamin Boyce. It's the thing you can't deconstruct. It's the frame. It's the frame that you have. In many ways, the frame has to be sacred.
To eliminate.
This is one of the greatest revolutions in human history, in my view. And the outcome was the emergence of what I call the unigender. The unigender is a genderless person, someone who identifies less with social constructs such as gender, stereotypical male or stereotypical female, and identifies much more, for example, with a career or with a lifestyle or with a sexual preference or orientation rather than with gender. Gender was an organizing principle. Gender is performative. It's a social construct. It's actually a script. It's a form of acting. And so now we have different other scripts. So studies by Lisa Wade and many other scholars are showing that women are defining themselves as masculine, while men didn't complete the transition from masculine to feminine. And this is called the stalled revolution. Women have become men, but men have remained men. End result, we have a single gender.
So let me, when you say that's taking it away from the social construct of what a man does and who he is and what have you, because before, up until recently, we had all sorts of, as you say, a script for what men were, identifying by what they did, their jobs, their roles in the family, etc., and likewise with women. With the erosion of that, with both sexes having, with a lot of crossover, if you take yourself away from those constructs, from those definitions, like a man puts out the rubbish and does what have you, you then become floating between the two. Because what I find is interesting in many African societies, before colonialism, before invasion and before slavery, because the tribe had to work together to get the harvest in, they couldn't, one lot do one thing and one lot do another. Everyone had to work together. The constructs of male and female that we have in the West, that we recognize, they weren't like that. And so you had many quote unquote genderless people that you looked at and you couldn't readily identify as being a male or a female, because people enveloped both sides just so the tribe could.
My guess that pretty early on, the male and the female knew exactly who the other ones were for reasons that seem abundantly clear to anyone of reproductive age. Anyway, the point there that there is a Douglas Murray makes the point about anti-racism as a new religion. Religions are, in many ways, the arena that we live within. And we can't escape it or avoid having to live at least within some arena. And so for, anti-racism has become a large one, anti-very many things. But again, all these anti-things are parasitic in that you can only be an anti-racist if racism continues to have more ontology than anti-racism, because once racism is gone, the antis poof, they lose their identity and they lose their existence. We'll go back to this.
Christian belief, how to put this, we cannot go back to a pre-Christian world. That at a minimum is, Tom's point is that at a very minimum.
Well,
right?
we can.
In other words, it's very difficult to retcon away many of these movements that we've been. These movements have retconned the world in a way that you really can't go back. And at least at this point, and Tom's about to make the point about they're about to have a little discussion about communism and Nazism, because in many ways the Nazi revolution was an attempt to go back to a much more a fervent naturalism where the survival, it was sort of a social Darwinianism put to the ultimate test.
Though we've tried it certainly in Europe with fascism. Fascism was, on one level, deeply, it was fascinated by the future. It was fascinated by tanks and airplanes and shiny new equipment. But it was also deeply backlooking. There was a conscious effort to go back to the pre-Christian world. Yes. So Mussolini is identifying with Augustus, and Hitler, actually, unlike Himmler, Hitler was very much identified with both the classical Greeks and the Romans. He saw them as Aryans.
And Freud made that statement that the Nazis were some kind of harkening back to the folk,
sure,
the pagan past.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, and by the way, I'd just add one other thing to that, which is a point that David Berlinski's made in a book, that actually, if you look back at the 20th century, what is the one thing that the murderers, gangs of Pol Pot, Hitler and Stalin and every other despot of the 20th century, what's the one thing they all had in common? None of them thought that God was watching.
But Douglas, I would distinguish the Nazis from those inspired by communist ideology.
Yeah.
Communist ideology bears the DNA of Christianity.
That was millenarian.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's all about the last will be first, the first will be last.
Yes.
Dives and Lazarus. Right. It's all there.
It's a secularized form of Christianity that denies that God is watching, and
with
therefore all things are
with
lawful.
a deep strain of the apocalyptic, this idea that the world can be born again, that New Jerusalem can be born. The thing about the Nazis is that, unlike the French or the Russian revolutionaries or the Chinese revolution, the French and the Russian revolutionaries who were bred of the matrix of a Christian society, unlike them, the Nazis consciously repudiate not just institutional Christianity, but the fundamental values of Christianity. Right. And they, Paul says there is no Jew or Greek. The idea of a kind of universal human dignity is fundamental to Christian ideology. They reject that.
As to Marx, but not to the Nazis.
Yeah, right. But and also the other core one, of course, that they reject is, I said that the image of the cross symbolizes the idea that the tortured triumphs over the torturer. That is not what the Nazis believe. No. The Nazis believe that the strong should crush down the weak, and they do it for the Nazis do it not because they want to be wicked or evil. They do it because they think that is what is morally justified.
If I can make a couple of points quickly, one thing is it's noticeable that we've devolved onto discussion of the Nazis, but there's a reason, which is that we also live still in the shadow of that.
We certainly do.
And Europe, where we're currently sitting, lives under a previous shadow as well. When Pope Benedict visited England, my friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs gave an address to Pope Benedict in which he said something very important. He said, the peoples of Europe didn't lose faith in God just simply because they lost faith in God. They lost faith in the idea of the peoples of God being able to get on with each other. Europe, as people know, in the 16th century was a hellish demonstration of the fact that religion brought war, brought turmoil to societies. In the 20th century, we have to work out how we have God after this, and we're still working that out. We're nowhere near a conclusion if we could ever get to one. But it's interesting that everything must always be polluted by it, because it's another one of the reasons why the peoples of Europe and the peoples of the Christian world moved away from God.
That's such an interesting.
Now, I think that's a great point, and it brings in the point of pluralism. There's a part of why you have. I think my mic's a little hot. Part of why you have a frame and a communal frame is so that not only that the people can cooperate and work together, but it's very difficult to have a frame that affords both enchantment and productivity without deep agreement on the frame. And part of why sort of the woke collage of agendas and ambitions is inherently unstable is because many of the frames are contradictory. You can't both be for women and not know what a woman is. You can't be anti-racism and also have, let's say, black pride. Because in one way or another, there's going to have to be a way in which multiple agendas can work together under a larger overarching agenda. And anti-bias, of course, can't live in a world where biases are necessary to, let's say, have a marriage or a relationship, or prefer in some way prioritize your resources for your child over the other people's children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the reasons that we've seen attempts to sort of see certain agendas reach the top. They always break down. A couple of years ago, I made a video that said basically God is the frame of all frames, because you're going to have a hierarchy, and you're going to need to have something on top of that hierarchy that not only that brings order to all the other agendas. Of course, Augustine talked about this in terms of ordered loves. You need your loves in proper order. If you have your loves in the wrong order, bad things happen. Tim Keller has applied this many times in his sermons, where he'd talk about, God is in a sort of the way. God is easy to have on top of the hierarchy because, by definition of the variety of definitions of what we mean by God.
Interesting observation, Douglas, because in essence he's saying that we've lost faith in God because we've become disillusioned with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think there was an interesting piece in the New York Times a couple summers ago by Ross Douthat, the very thoughtful columnist there, who is also, I think, a Catholic believer. Mm-hmm. And he was raising the question, and it's the same question I'd like to raise, which is, given all that's happened in the past, and given the human failures and the wars of the last century, is it yet still possible to rethink the God question? Because we didn't reject God because of a lack of evidence for the reality of God in creation or in our world. There's an intellectual antecedent. There's the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century. There's the 19th century scientific materialism. But then there's also this background of the human nature.
Part of the challenge and it's difficult having undeconstructed, reconstructed Christians in this space sometimes, because I think, I don't know if they can fully own up to the challenge that both Tom Holland and Douglas Murray face. And I don't say that as a skeptic, because I am not a skeptic. But in many ways, the narrative character of God that is that we find in the Bible, that we imaginally, I'm using Vervaeke's words, that we imaginally engage in the world with from the Bible. This God for individuals has to in a sense be battle tested. The individual is going to have to work through the various things. And I'm not saying that Stephen Meyer hasn't worked through those things. I don't know his story particularly, and I'm sure Esther will jump in and correct me where I'm wrong, which I'm grateful for. But so often in these, especially conservative spaces of many religious people, we sort of wade in quickly and say, but God, but God, but God. And I say, yes, of course, God. But in the in the person who is comfortable within Christianity, it's an easy thing to say. And I'm not saying Christians shouldn't say it. We have nothing else to say. But some appreciation, and I'm very interested, I haven't gotten past this point yet in the video, I'm very interested to hear what Douglas and Tom are going to say, because we've listened to plenty of Douglas and Tom. Douglas when he talked to Peugeot and Peterson, and Tom in many different interviews. The God as presented by Christians like myself, for whom I don't, while we all struggle with doubts and challenges, I've been seamlessly raised and have lived within it, so that I have I won't say no difficulty, but very little difficulty with the God of the Bible and that narrative and that character. It's not been ravaged for me, but Douglas and Tom are very much struggling in that.
Problem expressed in the religious wars. But if we look at the evidence itself,
Historical or scientific?
I mean scientific evidence.
All right, go ahead.
And I also think there's been a great shift in philosophy away from, there were these very facile disproofs of the possibility of the miraculous by people like David Hume and the Enlightenment. I think those are, most philosophers regard those as very weak arguments indeed. But I think the scientific evidence, to me, I had a long, myself, tortuous religious conversion. It took about 7 years. It was anything but a Damascus Road experience. I overthought everything.
Answered. Great. Super. Carry on.
Everything, but finally settled. And it was soon after that I began to encounter these scientists at major meetings who were themselves having intellectual conversions to some form of theism, and later even to Christianity. Alan Sandage, a notable figure, a great, long-time Jewish agnostic cosmologist whom I heard speak early in my scientific career, and he shocked the audience by explaining how he had come to a belief in God, not in spite of the scientific work that he did, but in large part because of it. He was one of the scientists who was documenting the expansion of the universe. And Douthit, in this piece in the New York Times 2 summers ago, said, look, in light of some of these developments, he was talking about, the one he cited was the fine-tuning argument that the physicists are talking about, that the universe not only had a beginning, but it's been finely tuned against all.
Now, my assumption, having listened to some of Stephen Meyer's before, some of you might say, well, what God? Well, which God? Well, what aspect of God? And I would imagine what the tree that we're barking up is a purposive God, a God who has will, a God who intends, a God who plans, and this is exactly the difficulty that many bump up against, because they say, well, there seems to be too much chaos in the universe. There seems to be too much loss. And those are difficult questions. You have the problem of evil, and of course you have the problem of good. If you're a Christian, you have the problem of evil because you say, wow, there's so much suffering. If you're not a Christian, in a sense, you have the problem of good, and you say, well, there's so much order. There's so much that actually works. There's so much beauty. There's so much joy. There's so much all of this.
All odds, and for no underlying physical reason to allow for the possibility of life. And some of these developments intellectually, I think, ought to cause us perhaps to rethink that default materialism or atheism that we all inherited out of the 19th century.
Now we have 2 modes of thought taking place here, as far as I can tell. You're talking about the evidence, the scientific evidence. I don't know how you respond to that, but I'm a layman. That strikes me as very compelling. That has to be taken into account. That new evidence can no more be unknown or undiscovered than can mode of thought number 2. Just a moment. Remember the trenches in the First World War? Those were Christian nations. That was pre-Nazi. Those were all Christian nations engaging in slaughter of each other on an astonishing, massive
and
scale.
It's a huge question. Where were the statesmen to stop that?
Where was God? Where was God? These are things that also the history cannot be unexperienced or unlived
It wasn't
either.
just the Second World War. I mean, Christian faith for many people died in the Somme. But I think that something has to be observed here, which is of what Stephen says, which is that if you're a person of faith, let alone a person of the Christian faith, whenever a new discovery comes up, you will want it to bolster the argument you have. Now, the problem I can say is that many atheists will take the same line, albeit the opposite way, which was that they will hope that it'll bolster their case. My own view, of course, remains we just don't know. And it seems to me that Christians will want the answers to be Christianity. Atheists will want it to be atheism.
Wow. Murray's good. Murray's good.
But the mode that our own age should try to be in should be to simply be open to these questions.
I completely agree.
So hold on. I'm going to reassert control and give the first question. Nope. It'll get more interesting.
Excellent.
So to take this, here's what I'd like to know. What I'd like to pursue next is, what do we need, A, and B, what is intellectually tenable at this stage in the scientific discoveries cannot be unknown, and the horrifying experiences of the 20th century cannot be unlived and should not be forgotten. Okay, 2 quotations. George Washington, and this is coming to you, George Washington farewell address, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. National morality. He's talking about an old-fashioned idea, virtue. Tom Holland in Dominion. In the ancient world, quote, even skeptics who scorn the possibility that a fellow mortal might truly become a god were happy to concede its civic value, close quote. Whether you believe in Christianity or not, all 3 of you grant that that is our moral, those are the moral waters we swim in. Do we need to behave as if it were true? How do you sustain the kind of civic virtue that everybody senses a decent society needs?
Well, so this is the question that Nietzsche, whose writings were given by the German government to soldiers marching to the Western Front, that he has posed most kind of challengingly, I think. And essentially, he is saying, can you have Christian values, Christian ethics, Christian morality without Christian belief? And his take, which has been very, very influential on me, is that communists, socialists, liberals, Nietzsche was particularly contemptuous of the English-speaking brand of liberalism, are essentially Christians manqués. They think that they have cast off Christianity, but they haven't really. And Nietzsche's great parable is that God is dead, that his corpse lies in a great cave, but that the corpse is so enormous that it continues to cast shadows, and these flicker and change, and we continue to see them. But that in the long run, this will generate convulsive process of change. And to be honest, that prophecy came true in the Third Reich. It came true much faster than he thought. And I think the shock of that was so great for us that in a way, Nazism served to create a new mythology. So if you like, the shadow that is flickering on our current cave is actually the shadow of God that's flickering on the shadow of the cave. Flickering on the cave is a Nazi one. And rather than the devil now, we have Hitler. Rather than hell, we have Auschwitz. And that is why we are so haunted by the Nazis. That's why Douglas said, I can't believe we got onto the Nazis already. But I mean, we're bound to, because I think before the Third Reich, people, even if they weren't Christian, they would accept Christ as the kind of the moral exemplar. And they would say, what would Jesus do? I think by and large, people now say, what would Hitler do, and do the opposite. And people accuse, the joke you go on social media, within 3 seconds, people will accuse you of being a Nazi. This is the kind of the great joke. But it's similar to the readiness that people in earlier ages might have said, to accuse people of being in hock with the devil or whatever.
That was a rather clever non-answer. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting answer. It's an answer he's given before, and it's very correct. I mean, Chesterton makes the point again and again that it's easier to sort of deal with Get someone coming to the door, so I have to get ready for him. It's easier. I make these videos while I do my work. It's. I mean, everything that Tom said there is true, and he's also right in that people look at Nazism and do the opposite. But of course, the deep irony is that, as Tom has mentioned in the Dellingpod podcast when the book first came out, that in this movement, you sort of have to. So we've talked in the marriage crisis video a little bit about the fact that evolutionary psychology is so prominent now, and so you see all of these internal tensions because evolutionary psychology wants to say things. You know, the naturalist fallacy, of course, gets pointed out again and again. Wants to say things that basically, well, that which is original is, if not good, at least most enduring. And so if you look at the negation of Nazism, it's going to wind you in some interesting places when it comes to what we consider to be natural.
But we fear and dread and loathe the Nazis for deeply, deeply Christian reasons. Because the question that none of us ever really pause to think is, well, what was so wrong with what the Nazis said? What's so wrong with being racist? What's so wrong with trampling down the weak?
By the way, our friend David Berlinski says the Holocaust was like the crucifixion. It was an event that changed everything.
Yes.
Which is fair.
Of course. I mean, in Celan's most famous poem, there's that terrible line.
Well, what's so interesting about that is you would have to ask why, because even though the Germans, of course, employed all sorts of modern ways of killing and exterminating, maybe human beings have been committing genocide for a very long time. And you know, the little quip about African tribes. Well, before slavery, before colonialization, you almost get the picture that they were just out there harvesting the food, and that you didn't have deeply violent genocidal wars, which are going on in every continent. It almost makes people imagine that Europe is the only place where they had wars. No. So the Holocaust having changed everything, maybe what it did was, well, but I don't know that it caused more of a meaning crisis than the trenches of World War I. It's just that maybe it ripped the pretense off of our self-righteousness and showed that, well, we don't just kill when the other side has a fighting chance. We even kill when our victims have no chance at all. And again, that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone.
Aber Tod ist ein Meister auf Deutschland. Death is a master from Germany.
All right, so back to, while I've got these two Englishmen all around this, so Charles, King Charles, gives a speech.
Douglas is now an American.
I'm not an American. I reside.
You reside in America.
You reside in America.
I pass.
Englishman in New York.
You don't pass for 1 second.
Pass.
You don't pass for 1 second. Charles, King Charles, it is the year 2022, and the evening his mother dies, the evening of the day on which he has become king, he gives an address to the nation in which he speaks about the special relationship of the crown to the Church of England, in which his own faith resides.
The role and the duties of monarchy also remain, as does the sovereign's particular relationship and responsibility towards the Church of England, the church in which my own faith is so deeply rooted.
This is what? A hopeless anachronism? Useful to the nation to continue some sense of continuity with the English Christian inheritance? What do you do with this?
If I could try to tie that up with what you said earlier about, and of course, Thomas Jefferson took the view that the civic virtues of Christianity were such that you could pretend to do it effectively, even if you didn't do the believing. And there's an interesting, I mean, there are people who believe in belief. I might be one of them. It's something that people can do. It's a good thing. It's all the data.
Not a crazy position.
All the
in a
data
chaotic
shows
world,
that
right?
you're going to be happier if you're a believer, and much more. In Britain, the established church has a very distinctive function, which is to effectively own rein in. How would you put it? Somehow temper the enthusiasm of religion, contain it within the state. It was a very important statement that he made. King Charles had in the 1990s toyed with this idea that he would, rather than take the title Defender of the Faith, would somehow be Defender of Faith. Right. And this is interesting because of course our own age has got a lot of sort of syncretic religion running through it. Hybrids of bits of Christianity, a bit of Buddhism, usually quite a large bit of Buddhism, and there was a sort of idea maybe he's going to do that. In which case, several things, including the established church, would have actually been in serious trouble. Right. He resisted that. He did a thing I think which is correct, is to say, no, this is one of the titles I've inherited, and I'm the defender of the faith. And
now it's really hard to really sort of suss this out, because it was easier, for example, if you had, let's say, an emperor in Constantinople or a bishop in Rome. You can sort of rally around that and define the faith. But even with Protestantism and denominationalism, your question of categorization, which features fairly prominently in the Peterson-Vervaeke conversation, is there to sort of dog you.
And that's just what we've inherited in England, in Britain.
I mean, just specifically on the mystery of royalty and Christianity, I think that one of the problems for institutional Christianity, for the churches, is that in a way they've been too successful, that their teachings have, in a sense, been nationalized. So particularly in European countries, perhaps more than the United States, but still in the United States, education, health, all these kind of things that previously were the responsibility of churches have now, they've been secularized. And in a sense, the church is...
Well, and to go back to where we were talking about with respect to anti-racism or the woke or all of these other religions that come up, whether like in Rami, the guy puts a jewel in his head and now he's an elf, and his partner is a furry, so she's there meowing and he's dressing up in Lord of the Rings elf costumes, and there's a but at the same time, for society you need a coherence where it all sort of hangs together.
Self has been secularized. It's the instinct, the responsibility of churches have now, they've been secularized, and in a sense the church itself has been secularized. It's the instinct, I think, of certainly in a national church like the Church of England, of many of the priests, is to identify with the kind of the preponderant ideology of the age, which is a secular one. My own personal feeling is that that's...
And of course, when the pandemic took off, Holland was on Unbelievable and other places talking about the fact that, well, do we really need the church to just mimic what the National Health Service is saying?
Horrible mistake, and that Christianity is nothing if it's not spectacularly odd. If the strangeness, the weirdness, the mystery is not given space to breathe.
And that comes across so beautifully in your writing, Tom.
Well, but so it struck me...
The preface of your book it really is jarring, because if you swim in Christian waters and you forget just how
odd it is.
How odd it is.
But it struck me very powerfully with the funeral of the Queen, that people were being touched by the strangeness of it, by the sense that the Queen was anointed. This is a ritual that goes back 1,000 years in England, but ultimately goes back to ancient Israel, to David and to Solomon.
Yes.
And people felt themselves touched and moved by something strange that they didn't understand. And it was a rare moment where a sense of the weird was allowed to enter into the very heart of the state, and people were stirred by it. And I think that it would be a terrible mistake for the new king if he, if presuming he wants the monarchy to survive, and indeed the Church of England to survive, if he was to stint on the element of the strangeness within the coronation. I think.
But that strangeness, again, to come back to where this video started in terms of the enchanted. You cannot have the enchanted without the strange, because to go once again back to McGilchrist, or quoting Owen Barfield, how is it that the more able man becomes to manipulate the world to his advantage, the less he can perceive any meaning in it? This is a paradox that has often been noted and has sometimes been attributed to fundamental perversity, a sort of pure cussedness and natural in human nature. The world has changed since the philosopher Owen Barfield, who's wrote these words 35 years ago, but the paradox, as he calls, has gotten no less resolved. Once we sort of are able to manipulate the world, once we have it, and this gets then into the seculum, once we sort of have it between our hands, it's disenchanted. And then suddenly, and that's, I think, when you get to the question of whether or not the Holocaust, to what degree did the Holocaust really change the world? In many ways, we had God to blame until we did it. We had God to blame for giving his chosen people a very difficult time for centuries, much of it documented. Now we have no one but ourselves to blame.
I think he should absolutely
I completely
play
agree,
it us.
but I've got a very quick observation as well, if I may. I completely agree with what Tom just said. There's a specific difficulty for Christians, which in certain other religions doesn't exist. And let me give an example, which is Judaism. Some years ago, I said to a rabbi friend, an Orthodox rabbi friend, I said, a rather rude question, but I said, would you agree that many people who come to your synagogue do not believe in God? And he said, most, I'd have thought. And I said, well, what lesson do you draw from that? And he said, this year in the UK, 98% of British Jews will be celebrating the holy days. Now, I say that because in Christian terms, there are reasons why Jews can be practicing without being believing. And there's a debate about believing and belonging. Well, yes, but what does it mean to be a Christian who wants Christian tradition to continue, but cannot go to the church or thinks other people can go for them?
To go back to my videos that I've been making about positive world, neutral world, negative world, the video I made about the Christian Reformed Church and same-sex marriage. There's a natural need, if you are a minority, whether that be a minority religion. Again, we talked about pluralism and the need to have agreement in order to actually inhabit an enchanted space. A very common question I get from people is they say, I want to believe in God, I want to believe in the resurrection, and I want to believe all the weirdness that Tom Holland has just said Christianity should have. I want to believe these things. How can I do that? I don't find myself naturally doing it because we don't choose our beliefs. Vervaeke and Peterson talked about that. We don't choose our beliefs. Our beliefs are the way we derive our beliefs is enchanted as well. Calvinism talks about that. We're given belief by the Spirit of God. It's a gift of God for us. So, and my advice to them is, okay, go to church. Well, what do you mean go to church? Is that Sunday morning? How often do I have to go? The more you want to believe, the more you go, the more you'll believe, probably. Because you're not going to believe without a thick community around you. And again, it's not just sort of bullshitting yourself. That's not the point, because you're going to have to go through all of those questions within the community. The community is going to have to be compelling, and your experience in it is going to have to be enchanted. Because again, Tom Holland brought in the strangeness of it. If you're a countercultural community and you value that community, you will practice the holy days of that community because you will know that that's important. And so I've been mentioning this Rami show that I've been watching on Hulu. he wants to be Muslim. So in the second season, he goes to Egypt, and because he's looking for himself, and he expects to go to Egypt and find an Islamic country. And one of his first shocks is he meets his cousin, and his cousin is so excited because here's his cousin from New York, and he's going to show him off at the greatest clubs. And we're not going to go to the mosque to pray. We're not going to do any of this Muslim stuff. We want the religion of America, basically. So there's all these subtle dynamics that goes on within the religious frame. And so to have so if you're a Jewish minority and you really value your culture, and whether or not you have this experience of believing in God, that you're sort of looking at others and saying, well, they really believe and I don't believe, and there are telltale signs of that, those are still going to be issues.
All right.
Well, this is what I appreciate about these two gentlemen so much, is that they both have this deep appreciation of the importance of Christianity and genuine belief in God. And at least in Douglas's case, can't quite get themselves over the line to belief. I don't quite know where Tom stands on that, but I'm used to engaging these very angry.
Did you watch those two? Go back. Watch them. I don't know, of course, but I think Tom and Douglas are in very similar spaces. Just watch those two.
Themselves over the line to belief. I don't quite know where Tom stands on that, but I'm used to engaging these very angry atheists who hate Christianity and hate belief in God. But in a piece I did for the Jerusalem Post last summer, eulogizing the great physicist Steven Weinberg, I talked about this, that there was the old new atheists, the Richard Dawkins, and Weinberg was one of them, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. But there's a kind of new atheist, people who authentically lament the loss of Christian belief in the Christian, of a theistic foundation, a Judeo-Christian foundation for our culture, but authentically.
Do we really want to call them new atheists? I don't know. I think let's just leave the new atheists, and let's think of a new name.
Also can't themselves come to belief, and I have hoped that my own work might open up that discussion in a new way, because we've inherited all this baggage from the Enlightenment and the rise of scientific materialism. Figures like Darwin, Marx, and Freud from the late 19th century, who so shaped the worldview of the 20th century. And yet I think there is a very legitimate and genuine intellectual opportunity to reassess these deep questions apart from the baggage of the religious wars. And within Christianity, I think there is a framework for explaining even how Christians can end up resorting to violence against each other, because there is this deep teaching about the fallenness of man, and that affects us all. The human nature problem is not eliminated simply because you believe in Christianity. But on the other hand, I think the materialists lack the intellectual framework to account for the extraordinary evidence that we have of design in the universe, and of for the creation of the universe, and these fundamental questions that we have assumed science has already adjudicated are, I think, being reopened by discoveries that have frankly shocked us. And even Richard Dawkins has acknowledged this. Last summer he talked about he was knocked sideways with wonder at the discovery of the digital signal, or the digital processing of information inside cells. It was not anything he expected from his blind, pitiless processes.
Stephen, let me hit you.
Yeah.
And I do mean to hurl it at you.
Excellent.
With a passage from St. Paul. This is 1 Corinthians 15. Speaking of odd, I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that he was seen of...
All these imaginative. I like my Paul with a little less hair, thank you.
500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, close quote. So St. Paul is right there ruling out the easy ethical option. Christ is the great teacher. We can take certain messages, follow his example. What would Jesus? No, that's not all. He is insisting that Christians believe in the resurrection.
He's appealing to the testimony of eyewitnesses.
And he is appealing to the testimony. He is saying, in effect, if you don't believe me, there's still several hundred people still alive. He's appealing to the testimony that had the greatest weight in Roman law and still has the greatest weight in our law, which is eyewitness testimony.
He's appealing to what we would call today an empirical basis for faith.
Okay.
And we have ruled that possibility out largely because of developments in Enlightenment philosophy, the secular Enlightenment philosophy, people like Hume who said that miracles were impossible, and because of developments in the 19th century in science which suggested that God did not exist, the rise of materialism. The miraculous accounts in the Bible are...
This is going to get interesting.
A great offense to the intellect of people who have been, been trained in schools like we've all been to, because we've inherited a worldview that says miracles are impossible. And that worldview is materialism. The probability of a miracle, given scientific materialism or scientific naturalism or scientific atheism as your worldview, is zero, because a miracle is an act of God. If God does not exist, there's no possibility of a miracle. And then when you read those the documents of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, you necessarily have to simply deduce that the events that are recorded could not possibly have happened because miracles are possible and there is no God to exist. Right. But if there is now a case, and I don't think there's ever not been a case for the reality of God, but I think the case has gotten so strong, and scientific atheism has become itself so weird in opposing it. We now have the multiverse hypothesis as an alternative to the evidence of design we have in the fine-tuning. My main work has been about the evidence of design at the foundation of life in biology, the digital code that's in the DNA. And to explain that, the chemical evolutionary theorists and secular evolutionary biologists have not come up with an evolutionary account of the origin of information. Some of them are now talking about the information coming from a space alien, the so-called panspermia hypothesis. And so you're getting this very strange way in which it's now scientific atheism that is engaging in the formulation of ever more epicycles of strange hypotheses.
So your point is...
My point is the belief in theism is again credible.
Let me frame it up.
Yeah.
Your point is that Big Bang, the discovery of fine-tuning, the discovery of unbelievably complex code, even in the simplest forms of life, that makes a belief in resurrection, Orthodox Christianity, intellectually respectable.
It makes a belief in theism very credible. And that changes the prior probability, as the philosophers would say, of a miracle. And that means you have to reassess those biblical texts on straight up historical grounds without having a presupposition that precludes the possibility that there is historical support for the events recorded therein.
Do you buy any of this?
Well, what I would say, to slightly spin what Stephen's saying in a different way,
all right,
is that it's not as though secular liberals, whether they're atheist, agnostic, or whatever, aren't equally capable of believing weird, mad things. And talking about alien seeding stuff, I mean, that's quite odd. But I would say that also very odd is, say, a belief that human beings have rights, the idea that human rights exist. Most people in the West believe in human rights, but human rights don't exist objectively. I mean, they're as fantastical as believing in angels. And they have a very specific, their origins very specifically rooted in Christian theology. It's formulated by the lawyers who are in the wake of the great revolution of the 11th and 12th century, are trying to construct a framework of law for the Christian people. And they look to the scriptures and they see that Christ teaches that those who are rich should give shelter and food and water and clothing to the poor, and they deduce from that the instinct that the poor therefore have rights to
He's an artful dodger, that Holland.
These things. And this sets in train this incredibly fertile notion that human beings have rights. Now, people today are very reluctant to face up to the idea that this is a very culturally contingent idea rooted in Christian theology, medieval Catholic theology. And so they say, well, you'll find human rights, it's in China or Greece or Rome or whatever, but it isn't. And I think that what I have found meditating and reflecting on the incredible inheritance of Christian theology and practice and liturgy and all kinds of things is that I want to believe in the things that I believe in as a secular humanist. I want to believe in human rights. And if I can believe in that, there are times where I think, well, I might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. If I can believe in human rights, then why can't I believe in angels?
Can we, Stephen and I, push you then on your belief?
Well, so as a historian, in the West, you are the heir to two different traditions. You're the heir to the Greek tradition of history, in which, to be honest, the gods don't play much role. Certainly, they're present in Herodotus. They're virtually invisible in Thucydides. But you also have the tradition of history that you get in the Bible, where events are shaped by the hand of God, and those are traditions that feed through into the Western inheritance of history. I would absolutely identify myself as a historian with the Greek tradition. I don't think that it's my role to identify the hand of God. I try to explain Christian history
So certainly not in the tradition of Homer.
in human terms. But having said that, I have found the experience of immersing myself in the history of Christianity and the examples of Christian history often to be unsettling. It often is. But I think, even when I'm unsettled by Christian history, I realize...
Well, and that's interesting because he's also the guy who can again and again and again and again make the point that it's got to be weird. And it's like, okay, you wanted weird, you got weird. What exactly? And I don't say this in any way to demean and dismiss. I mean, anybody who's listened to this channel knows I'm the huge fan of Tom Holland. There's no question about that. But it's almost it's almost Jesus' complaint in Matthew 11. Did you want a mourner? I can. Did you want a moralist scourge? I can be a scourge. Do you want a celebrative dancer? I can dance. What are you looking for? And again, I'm not asking that anybody be disingenuous, or I'm not trying to bully anybody. Anybody who watches me knows that's I in no way would want to bully anybody into as if it could happen these days. But at some point, there's always the back and forth with respect to Jordan Peterson too. At some point, one just gives in, and it happens. It's a lot like falling in love. And there was a TikTok today that was on Twitter about some woman who was talking to her TikTok fans about she's been going out with this one guy for 6 or 9 weeks, and they promised not to have sex with anybody else while they're together now. But then she went on another date with a guy who had a better banter game, and so now she's having second thoughts. I mean, we are not masters of our own houses, so it's I don't know. I find this whole thing just endlessly fascinating.
Realize that it's for Christian reasons. If I'm
That's
unsettled,
so
if I'm unsettled by the Inquisition, it's
Yeah.
because they are killing innocent. It's powerful people killing an innocent person. And why am I revolted by that?
The cruelty of the ancient world.
Well,
the Greco-Romans would not have worried about those same types of events in the way we do.
As Dostoevsky, in his great story about the Inquisitor, Christ. If you as an atheist are enshrine the Inquisition as a model of something horrific, it's for Christian reasons. It's because you are shaped by a culture that has had an innocent person put to death by a state apparatus at the heart.
Tom, can I yes.
And so therefore, I feel that the kind of the bundle of my instincts, my beliefs, my presumptions are generated by this incredibly mysterious Christian inheritance, and I am I'm very open to accepting that there is a strangeness there that I don't want to deny.
All right, you know what? Thank you.
May I talk about two types of strangeness at some point? But Douglas has
yes,
been trying to get
you
in.
get dibs on 2 points of strangeness.
By the way, when you quoted St. Paul and
Yes.
you were talking about that, am I right, Tom? Who's the ancient who sees St. Paul and recorded it? Somebody, there's a physical description of St. Paul.
I don't think so. There are
right?
medieval letters in which Seneca and St. Paul are supposed to have communicated, but I don't think
it's interesting.
Douglas,
Anyhow,
so you would not. It is possible, but you do not yourself. It is possible for a with-it intellectual of the year 2022 to believe in a resurrection.
Is with it still with it? I just wonder.
It's not possible. C, it's none of my business, and I shouldn't even be asking that question because somehow or other that violates
I think all
protocols.
Things are possible. I mean,
This guy's getting into Justin Brierly territory here.
But you see what I'm saying.
I think
this
that
is a very raw claim.
Being a philosopher and practicing, believing Christian has been a tension for many years now. I mean, it's not as though they don't overlap or can't overlap, but it definitely suffers a tension that it wouldn't have done, say, 400 years ago. My main problem is that nobody wants to admit what they don't know, and there's a tendency towards dogmatism on all sides in our age, and one of the consequences of that is, for instance, I mean, Christianity is, if you use it as a basis and an explanation for life, you also have to explain why the religion's central tenet is the complete inverting of the thing we know most of all, which is death. This is in itself a massive claim, but it's fueled 2,000 years of faith. Now,
Murray's a sharp cookie. I really like Murray.
Claiming that the whole cosmos can rip, as it were, is what has fueled the Christian faith. It is an unbelievable thing that has happened, which
and that gets earlier to the speech of Tom Holland's that I talked, where you have the and of course Peterson goes into this with Jung. Peterson's assertion that Jung was basically saying that the church looked at the world or people looked at the world and basically said, you know, we're waiting for the new heavens and the new earth, and they don't seem to come. And with Christianity, there's always, well, it's just around the corner. It's just around the corner. And they've been expecting it just around the corner for a very long time. Maybe it's time for us ourselves now to make heaven on earth, to create utopia, Nowheresville.
Millions and millions of people still on Earth, of course, believe. But if I can say, this is why I favour that the argument that Habermas made some years ago. What he described as the awareness of what's missing, because it's the other flip side of that, the unwillingness of the modern West to admit that there is this God-shaped hole in the culture. We have songs where people talk about angels, people talk about being reunited after death, and say, in what metaphysical system are you doing this? Like, what's the game you're playing here? I would just like people to at least concede that they need, to use Rilke, they need to live in the questions in the hope that at some point they live their way into the answer.
You still have dibs. I'm coming next to you, Stephen.
No worries.
Here's Roger Scruton, Douglas. And the question, of course, is going to be, do you subscribe to this? Anybody who goes through life with an open mind and heart will encounter moments that are saturated with meaning, but whose meaning cannot be put into words. These moments are precious to us. When they occur, it is as though on the winding, ill-lit stairway of our life, we suddenly come across a window through which we catch sight of another and brighter world.
Yes.
A world to which we belong, but which we cannot enter. There are many who would dismiss this world as an unscientific fiction. I am not alone in thinking that it is real and important.
What a quote! What a quote! And in this, that was very good. I did a conversation with Ken Lowry of Climbing Mount Sophia, and I'm sure it'll be out any day now. I don't know the rhythm by which he releases conversations on his channel. But, you know, we got into that, the narrative and that which is beyond narrative. What a quote.
You could sign your name to that, couldn't you?
I actually have the volume of essays that appears in as a preface, introduction by me.
And you know perfectly well that's exactly where
Yes.
I found it.
I think it's a beautiful expression of something that Roger intuited, and so do I. It is.
And that is deeply Christian, isn't it?
Well,
I
Not
think
explicitly, or
I think it's somebody feeling that there is a nymph in a stream in Greece in the 5th century would probably say
I
something
thought I
the same.
had Holland corralled at last, and now he's off on nymphs. Go ahead.
Well, but in fairness to Tom there, this again was where Tom started at the beginning of this conversation, talking about the disenchanting thread within the Christian tapestry. And the idols of Egypt are stock and stone, and the you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make a graven image, the biblical creation story where it's not that the other functionaries, as John Walton calls them within the creation story, are unconscious necessarily, but they are not the kinds of gods within a metaphysical realm that you find in the other creation stories. So, there's tension in here.
Here's what I say about it. Is that there, Roger is referring to a very important instinct, which is the thing that should always jolt a true atheist, which is that everybody in their lives will experience moments of awesome feeling of some kind, transcendence. It might happen with seeing a person. It might feel in.
And of course, the atheists account for that. Say, well, that's just a psychological factor. Those are the chemicals of the brain, and this gets back to the abolition of man, the Joe Rigney presentation that I did a video on not too long ago.
Eros. It might be in human love. It might be in a place, in a building. It might just be waking up in the morning. Everybody at some point in their life has to contend with this question of what is this thing that I feel to be true and cannot reach. Christians would obviously say it's the Christian God. I think the rest of us have to say we'll live in the question.
Stephen, speaking of questions.
Well, a couple things. The arguments that first persuaded me of theism were actually philosophical arguments. And there has been, in the last 30 or 40 years, a tremendous renaissance in philosophy towards belief. You have major figures like Richard Swinburne at Oxford or Alvin Plantinga at Notre Dame, and this whole Midwest school. So there are plenty of philosophers.
And Calvin. Alvin was at Calvin before, those Roman Catholics wooed him over to that institution that's at least Catholic in name.
Who now are very convinced theists, whether they be Christians or Jews or something else. And I think one of the huge questions that we've inherited from the Enlightenment is the question of knowledge. How is it that we know the world around us at all? And it turns out that secular materialist thought has been unable to provide a justification for belief in the reliability of the human mind. And that has led to this radical relativism that has expressed itself both philosophically and
that point that he made about not only the reliability of the human mind, you'll find Peterson and Vervaeke touching on that, but from the other direction. The fact that we can reliably seem to map. There's in a sense why is it we can decode the world around us productively
in the culture. And one of the best reasons to believe in the reliability of the mind, which was one of the reasons that led to the scientific revolution, was that our minds are made in the image of God, who is a rational creator, who has endowed the physical world with a kind of order and rationality that we can perceive because there's a principle of correspondence between the way he made our minds and our ability to perceive the reason and the order and the design that he put into nature. This was the key idea of intelligibility that inspired much of the scientific revolution. And so the problem of knowledge, I think, is solved elegantly by the presupposition of theism. So there's an argument. The argument that persuaded me was sometimes called the argument from epistemological necessity. St. Augustine put it this way: we believe in order to know. If you believe first in the existence of a creator who made our minds as a reliable instrument to know the world that he made, we also then can have confidence in our ability to know things. And this was the basis of the scientific revolution. So I think philosophically, there just as there is scientifically, I think, movement back towards a theistic position, I think that same thing is happening in science.
In philosophy.
In philosophy,
Right,
yes.
right.
Now, I take very seriously what Douglas said earlier about the problem of confirmation bias, that we all want to believe the thing that confirms the beliefs that we already have. There is a way, I think one of the benefits of philosophical training is that it allows the assessment of arguments irrespective of the motives of the arguer. And I accept that there is a motive on behalf of believers, of Christian and other theistic believers, to believe in God, because it helps answer some of those existential questions, and it gives us a hope for the afterlife. We all want that. On the other hand, there's also a motive that's been often pointed out for people who don't believe, because not believing in God also releases us from a sense of moral accountability to a higher authority, and we'd all like to be autonomous at some points in our lives, at least. Now, I think ultimately those two things are a wash and should be treated as a wash. We should set those motives aside and try to assess the case for or against a transcendent deity based on the evidence and based on some very fundamental philosophical arguments. That's what I attempt to do in the book, Return to the God Hypothesis. I think there are a lot of people who are in the field of philosophy of science, epistemology, who are really wrestling with these deep questions at that level and trying to extricate them from both the cultural baggage and the intellectual baggage of the last few centuries, and to reassess the God question afresh in light of evidence and apart from some of these things that are not strictly speaking evidential matters or matters of reason, but rather of cultural baggage.
I think there are a lot of people who so he sort of walked us through how he arrives at this. And I think there's a lot of people that aspire to walk this way, because I think this particular approach has a high degree of cultural approval. I just don't think most people do it this way. They don't. And not to take anything away from his argument, but if you watch Tom and Douglas while he's talking, they're kind of relaxing. Whereas earlier, if you watch them, they're sort of, we get gripped in different ways.
As a militant atheist, I would want to push back against Stephen and his colleagues by saying, even if you find what you think you're looking for, it doesn't necessarily mean the Christian God. You might, and this would seem to me to quite. But if I was in Stephen's position,
that's a separate show.
If I was in Stephen's position and leaning on the secular atheists, I think the thing I would be asking them is, there is a modern understanding of yourself that doesn't ring true with your feeling of yourself. So, for instance, we don't like our sense of ourselves. And now Tom might argue this is because we've just inherited this from Christianity, but...
I would, Douglas, I would.
You would.
He would indeed.
You would.
He's made that rather clear.
But I would suggest that many of the modern materialist understandings of ourselves, the sense that there's no particular purpose and so on, doesn't ring true with the sense people have of themselves, which is that there must be something in ourselves that is extraordinary, and it must have meaning and purpose. And either we're meaning-seeking beings and there is no meaning, or there is meaning. But it doesn't sit well with us when we're told you're just, for instance, a consumer. You would go, I'm what? We feel ourselves to be something else. And I would lean on, well, what is that?
Well, and this is why it's so much more interesting to talk to you than it is to talk to Richard Dawkins, because the ardent scientific atheists, the new atheism, which was just a repackaging of late 19th century scientific materialism, has written off all of these things. It's blind and deaf to the things that are truly human about us. We all sense that there's something more than blind, pitiless indifference at work, and I think wrestling with that is the thing we all should be doing. Yeah.
I think also a case can be made for the significance of Christianity that enthusiasts for evolution would accept.
That who would accept?
Enthusiasts for theories of evolution would accept that materialists who are in favor of, who believe in theories of evolution.
Tread carefully.
Well,
he knows this ground. Go ahead.
Okay, but what I would
And those who love dinosaurs?
So what I would say is that, objectively speaking, by whether measured in terms of adherence now or the influence that it's had on the course of global history, Christianity is the most successful explanation for what human beings are doing, what life is for, why we were created, why there is suffering, all these things. Christianity has offered human beings the most successful explanation for that.
But you
and at
know
the
that
very
I-
least,
I
and at the
want to-
very
I
least,
want to
at the
hear you
very
say,
least.
yes, and I think it may be true. But you won't do that.
Well, if you I mean, on the materialist level,
He went full Justin Brierley right there. I don't even know if Justin goes that far. Justin always asks the question, but
might say, well, it's an adaptive strategy, and therefore, based on terms of how successful it's been, it's certainly worth
You
considering.
could frame it that way, Tom. You could frame it
It's
that way.
certainly worth considering.
But
I
there's
consider
a
that
philosophical
a triumph to
no,
get you there.
No, that
Tom
was
Holland.
well said, and you could frame it as a successful adaptive strategy, or if you look at it philosophically, you could say that the Christian world and life view has a comprehensive explanatory power, both about human failing and about the evidence for the reality of God, that is unique, and I think that's a reason to believe it.
You get a word, and then I want to close us by going back to Matthew Arnold, if I may. Is that fair?
Just a very quick observation, which I
Yes.
do think we need to acknowledge, which is we are talking, of course, about the West and Western faith at the
Yes.
moment. And Tom, certainly, I know, has traveled, has seen the experience of the beleaguered churches in the Middle East, as I have. Yes. And I have seen in our own day Christian faith of a kind that our predecessors would have recognized and we don't remember is going on. And if you travel to, as I have, northern Nigeria, and you see people praying
Yes,
the Lord's
yes,
Prayer and
yes,
saying,
yes.
deliver us from evil, and they were chased across the fields and they lost their brother the day before in a machete attack. These people are burning with a faith that our predecessors would have recognized.
Well, absolutely, but I would say on top of that, that what's been happening in Africa is a process of conversion akin to the conversion of Western Europe and Northern Europe
In the first century.
in the early Middle Ages.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It
In the
is,
early mid-
you know, we're living in one of the great ages of Christian evangelism. And I would say also that we're living through, so there are two great, I think future historians of religion will look back at this age and say there are two great kind of convulsive currents, one of which is radical Islam, which is in everybody's faces, it's part of the headlines. Yes. The other is Pentecostalism, which is below the surface, but is blazing, you know, it's a great spirit rush. I mean, that's what it is. It's the blaze of the spirit. And that is transforming, you know, it's not only converting people to Christianity, but it's also, say, transforming the balance between Catholicism and Protestantism in Latin America. So this is an age of very vital Christian faith.
okay. So I'll leave a little extra, so you've got the incentive to go to the original video and give them your click and give them your comment. And of course, the link to the original video is down in the notes. Very interesting conversation. A lot of fun. I think part of what my frustration often with sort of, we've got the and Peterson called them celebrity atheists. My frustration sometimes with the celebrity evangelists is, okay, get them over the line, and then what? And of course, I'm all for them. I'd love nothing better than to have Douglas Murray and Tom Holland stand up and say, "I believe." Okay, and then what? Maybe a little clip from Peterson and Vervaeke.
have as a final solution, in some sense, to that, the acquiescence to that process. Okay, so let me offer...
Isn't that the... Sorry, but isn't that the ultimate version of your metagame?
Yes. Yes, definitely. Definitely. Yes. Okay, so let me throw this...
And there is a notion of this in Christianity, especially in Eastern Orthodoxy. You see it with Gregory of Nyssa, and you see it in Maximus, and it's this notion of epictasis, that we don't come to rest in God.
Right.
What God is the meta affordance, so that we continually self-transcend through God.
Yeah, yeah.
This is the further up and further in.
That's the Jacob's Ladder vision, I think, too.
Right.
Right, to ascend continually towards a destination that's infinitely receding.
That's right.
Right, and that grows as it recedes.
But this is the thing, the infinity is not inaccessible to you, right? Because the infinity is not just receding from you, it's also reaching towards you. And this is reality. Reality is constantly shining into your frame with intelligibility and constantly receding out into the mystery. And I think
and that's the parallel of the Greek idea of the logos, I think, with the Judeo-Christian idea of the logos.
I think so too. I mean, there's lots of people who won't like that, but I think the notion of the logos, that it's, especially as you see it coming through the Neoplatonic tradition and taken up into dialogos, into dialectic. I think that deeply converges. The Christian model is ultimately a model of that, and this is, I'm not going to try and do anything, but the paradox of the unity trinity is an attempt to somehow say there's something inherently dialogical, I would argue, about how we come into relationship with ultimate reality.
Right.
And that's
right, and it's an attempt to solve the problem of unity and multiplicity as well. So I've been looking at the transformation.
Okay. Maybe a good way to land this plane is with, it seems a little ironic, but Rosaria Butterfield on Beckett Cook's show, where she tells her story a bit.
So I started reading the Bible because I'm an English professor. It's not like I could go to a Promise Keepers rally and shove a microphone in somebody's face and say, how do you feel about, patriarchy or something? So I started reading the Bible, and I started meeting with Ken and Floy. And, I had a stickum on my desk at the time that said, I would rather be wrong on an important subject than right on a trivial one. And I've always felt that way. I'm a truth seeker, and Ken and Floy and I met. I probably had maybe 500 meals at his house. That would be that's like the short end of it. Wow. I met the entire, church community. I saw the way his house functioned. It was amazing, right? I mean, we would talk about hard and heavy things. We would read the Bible. We would pray. We would sing psalms. We'd come back and do it again. And this was the 90s. This is New York. My lesbian partner and I, we were so non-heteronormative. We would not use the word marriage, even if, it's just, just forget it. But,
right.
Our home was a lot like the Smiths' home, except for, we weren't Christians, but our home was open. Members of the gay community would come in. In fact, in my gay community in New York, somebody's home was open every night of the week. For food and fellowship, and just to stand between you and suicide, and you and another.
Now it's helpful to know she's sort of talking about a book where she talks about this. There's a lot more of this at the end of this video, but
who's been diagnosed with AIDS now. It was a scary time, a very scary time, and I couldn't help but to notice there was an aesthetic and a palpable difference between my house and Ken and Floy Smith's house. And that's that my house was filled with anxiety and constant, frenetic political activism. And, at Ken's house, they would talk about hard things, but at a certain point, they'd open the Bible, they'd pray, and they would do this thing called leave it at the cross. And then they'd go on and laugh and feast and have fun. And I got the sense that they weren't insomniacs either. They could sleep at night. And I was intrigued by that. I was intrigued by that. And I came to the Bible with a long list of things I I was mad about and I needed to work through. And Ken and Floy agreed to work through with me, just work through all of these points, patriarchy, slavery, just these big life issues. These were not small things for me. I had committed my life.
Now, I'm a little cautious at this point with this video because some people are going to say, well, it's having all the answers. But I don't think that's really it. I think it's much more, she was attracted to the lifestyle, which sounds ironic because obviously this conservative reformed family had a very different lifestyle than what she had, but they weren't afraid to go through the questions. I wonder if it's here. I mean, there's a line I want to get to. I don't remember if it's here or earlier.
To standing with the disempowered and to living in a way that made this world a better place. And I was confident that the Bible stood against all of that. And so anyway, in 2 years, I read the Bible through 7 times, and which sounds crazy, but I'm that's what I do. So,
and but why, by the way, while you were reading through the Bible 7 times, or even the first time, what were you, were you getting it? Were you liking it? Like, how are you reacting to it?
Yeah. Well, I study hermeneutics. I'm fascinated by it. In fact, I was really fascinated by it because I had never read it before. And I like a new book. I like reading new books, but I was fascinated by it because of the different hermeneutical voices you have in this book. I mean, it's a very meaty book, right? I mean, you've got the judicial law and the moral law and the ceremonial law, and it's interwoven using literally every single genre that ever existed. I mean, that was fascinating to me. Like, that was really, really interesting. And so I was very excited about this book. I was very excited to tear this book apart. That's what I did, and I enjoyed doing it. And
I'm not getting to the place I want to hear.
But one of the letters came from Ken Smith. It was an amazing letter. I thought, this man is really smart. If I'm going to write a book about the religious right, this is the kind of person I need to understand. And quite frankly, I looked at Ken Smith as my personal and unpaid research assistant. And so I thought, well, of course I'll have dinner with you. I'll have lots of dinners with you. Do you mind if I take notes? And of course, Ken, being a real Christian, didn't mind at all. He didn't mind at all. Yeah. And so he and his wife, Floy, they welcomed me into their world, and they came into my world, and they didn't act as though I was polluting them. And early on in our friendship, Ken said to me, there's a difference between acceptance and approval. And if you can live with that difference, I can live with that difference.
I love that. And
yeah,
it was like kind of
yeah, there's a difference between acceptance and approval. And then obviously I played the other place. In so many of these videos about trying to get people across the line, there's a sense of, and this is a very Baptist-y sense. I get, and maybe that's not being fair to Baptists. I don't want to be unfair to Baptists, but there's an altar call, and it's a revival. There's an altar call. We're gonna get you up in front. We're gonna get you across the line, and then but then the question is, and then what? Well, and then on to where Peterson and Vervaeke were just sort of knocking on the door of further up and further into Christ, into this life in this age with all of that, and again, then back to what she said about. I'll just play it again because it was really good.
So non-heteronormative. We would not use the word marriage, even if it's just just forget it. But
right.
Our home was a lot like the Smiths' home, except for we weren't Christians, but our home was open. Members of the gay community would come in. In fact, in my gay community in New York, somebody's home was open every night of the week. for food and fellowship, and just to stand between you and suicide, and you and another, who's been diagnosed with AIDS now. I mean, it was a scary time, a very scary time. And I couldn't help but to notice there was an aesthetic and a palpable difference between my house and Ken and Floy Smith's house. And that's that my house was filled with anxiety and constant, frenetic political activism. And, at Ken's house, they would talk about hard things, but at a certain point, they'd open the Bible, they'd pray, and they would do this thing called leave it at the cross. And then they'd go on and laugh and feast and have fun. And I got the sense that they weren't insomniacs either. They could sleep at night.
And that's where this faith comes around. That's where, our heart, I know they, Vervaeke and Peterson sort of poked at the resting, because it gets into Genesis. It gets into Genesis 2 and the seventh day, the Sabbath day, the day of rest. And that's not simply a day to take a nap in the Christian Reformed tradition, or a day to cease from doing certain physical labor. I much prefer John Walton's take on it, where that's a day of the commencement of the shalom, a commencement for the glory, a commencement for everything that creation had been leading up to. That's a day for beginning to live the joyful story as intended. And it's the feasting at the end of the battle. It's the joy at the end of the struggle. And the Christians in her story could wrestle with all the things and then finally laugh, because it was not up to them finally to win the war or to rule the world, or to that they were kept in the hands of their God, and whatever came, they knew that's the faith that they had. And it's the faith that looks beyond into all of those. I made this point on the Climbing Mount Sophia podcast. It's the faith that looks beyond into, you're shooting towards those ideals and you believe we're going to get there. And the resurrection isn't just a story of Easter and renewal and things like that. It's that I can participate in that resurrection. It's that even though I can't figure out how it's going to be or what the details are going to, and what God's going to do with all of this other stuff, it's that even me, it's the language of the Heidelberg Catechism, I participate in this resurrection. And it is a promise that I have. So I might lose this battle, I might lose my life, I might lose everything, but my life is hidden in Christ in heaven, where moth and rust can't consume. And that then gives us a confidence and a peace that all of the activism cannot touch. So, nice little ending to this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. Leave a comment.